From the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, this is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity.
I'm Macie Bridge with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and this is Solo, a series on solitude, loneliness, and being alone.
Hey, Macie.
Hi, Ryan.
It's good to be here talking to you. The tables have turned, the host of now the interviewee.
It's true. Thanks for helping me wrap the series.
I'm really excited for this. I've been interested in the question of loneliness and solitude for a while, and I was really excited to see you take up the series. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about what you were hoping for when you started your investigatory journey.
Mm-hmm. So I think you were the one who pitched loneliness to me because Miroslav had done some thinking on it as well. And I was excited about it because loneliness has been something that I have also been thinking about, partly because loneliness is a thing that I have experienced in my own personal life over the last few years. Even though I'm a person who I think is very well surrounded by incredible people, loneliness is an emotion that I have felt and that I have sat with. And it's also something that I've observed quite a lot in different forms in my peers and just in the world around me. And I've heard the buzz in the media. So I was coming into the series personally curious for myself and for my generation, I think. And one of the things that I was particularly curious about coming into the series was I didn't want to, as I was curating these interviews, approach it with the goal of trying to look for a solution to loneliness, because I think that loneliness, it's a human experience, and going in with the approach of trying to solve it, like not something that would be worthwhile. And that's where kind of the lens of also thinking about solitude came into the series as well. So I kind of came in with this conviction of like, let's be curious. That's where we ended up curating this beautiful diversity of experts and thinkers to kind of chime in on the subject. And I'm really grateful to have had the space to just dive in so many different angles.
Where did your curiosity lead you? What are the big takeaways for you after all these conversations?
Mm-hmm. So many directions. I think one of the things that stands out to me as maybe the heaviest hitting takeaway for me was that loneliness simply is something that we're all going to have to sit with. And I think, I said I'm not looking for a solution, but one of the definitions of loneliness that came up throughout all of these interviews was loneliness being this gap between what we have in our lives relationally and what we want in our lives relationally. Miroslav and I kind of talked about the creation story and the ways that loneliness shows up in Genesis and in God's creating of Adam. It is not good that man was alone. And so realizing that for many of us, if we have a gap between what we want in our lives relationally and what we have, we're going to sit with feelings of loneliness. And that's just going to be a part of our human experiences. And so for me, it was kind of like, there really is no solution. But also that's okay. So what do I do with that? And there were a lot more directions coming out of this series than I anticipated. One of those being a number of my conversations pointed towards the church and pointed outside of ourselves, thinking about loneliness as an opportunity to look outside of myself. Okay, I'm sitting with these heavy feelings of I don't have what I want in one facet of my relationships or another. How can I use that as a motivation or a signal to turn towards my neighbor? In my interview with Laura, we got into what does that look like when that's the outside world, when that's our creaturely neighbors, whether that's going on a walk and actually observing the chipmunks and the birds and the bugs that we share our world with, or really using that as motivation to think ecologically about like, how are we tending for the world around us? But then in many of the conversations that also turned towards the church, that surprised me, actually.
Why?
I guess when we talk about loneliness, we talk about solitude, we're talking about ourselves as individuals. And again, I was so set on, I'm not coming up with any solutions, that when a number of the interviews kind of naturally turned towards like, actually, this is a call to our communities. That was a positive surprise to me. And yeah, an exciting turn. It was Felicia who first brought that up, I think, talking about the digital age and the ways that, technology in some ways is fostering relationship across geographical divides, but at the same time, it's just not in person with us. And that's where the church is. And so having that revelation, that interview with Felicia was exciting. Oh, the church is embodied where people are. And that means the church is at such an advantage to speak into what's happening in our world. And that I'm taking away a lot of hope from the series with.
That's interesting to me. I kind of feel like I want to push a little bit on your no solutions approach.
I know.
And say, and loneliness may be inescapable. It may be part of our creaturely lot, but that doesn't mean that there are no gradations of loneliness, no better and worse lonely situations. And I think you're bringing up the kind of in-person embodied community in the church points to ways that we might say there are some particular forms of loneliness in our culture today that might be worth some intentional effort to address. But I'm going to ask you and hope you have some thoughts. It has struck me that churches can be pretty lonely places, even when they're in person. Oftentimes, even congregations are especially good communities for the people who've been there for a long time, which is to say, like it can be a lonely thing to come into a place where a bunch of people seem like they've got a good community thing going on.
Absolutely.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on ways churches in particular ought to be kind of intentional about resisting the forces that might make them lonely making places rather than loneliness is met and moves through and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. That didn't come up specifically in any one of the interviews, but thank you for bringing that up, because I think the thing when we were talking about the church, what was embedded there was maybe not that the church isn't addressing this perfectly right now, right? Because we have this problem in the world. And if the church were on top of it, maybe who knows what it would look like. But rather that this is an opportunity for the church to do some self-evaluating and step up, those of us who consider ourselves. And I think that what you're naming speaks to when we're carrying loneliness or experiencing loneliness in a community, we can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely.
Yeah.
The key there is when we're building a relationship, we're looking for people who really see us and who are digging into our lives. That was language Lydia brought up in my last interview is who's really digging into the dirt of your life with you. And I think so when you enter into a church and they've got this great community thing going and you're sitting in the back pew and waiting for somebody to say hi to you, yeah, of course that's going to be lonely because nobody there is ready. You haven't built that relationship yet to dig in. I think that is probably one of the main points of focus that those of us in the church who are trying to be attentive to this issue can really take away as like a very concrete approach to the loneliness epidemic would be to say when that person who's never visited before comes in and is sitting by themselves, not just to say, hi, welcome, come to coffee hour, but to say, who are you? And what brings you here, and to really do that listening work. And it's once you get into that second layer of relationship that we start to see, I think, feelings of loneliness shift. And that's also to say, like, when we're saying that loneliness is just a part of our human experience. Like if I'm feeling lonely because I've lost a parent or I'm grieving the loss of some specific relationship, that's the church or other relationships in the world are not necessarily going to fit that exact box.
Right.
But as humans, we desire a variety of relationships and we need a variety of relationships. And so there is a sense of kind of filling the cup in other and surrounding ourselves with community that will in some ways maybe help us to hold those gaps in our relational needs a little bit more gently with a little less heaviness.
Yeah, there's the kind of first order loneliness of loss in the example that you're talking about. There could also then be the second order of loneliness of feeling abandoned in your loss, right?
Yeah.
Of not having people around to hold you. And well, that gets into all of the hard pastoral relational stuff of grief, which I've always felt listed about myself. But you talked with Lydia about death a good bit, and it sounds like grief is a thread in these conversations. How much is it worth distinguishing different kinds of loneliness such that you could, as you're thinking about it for your own life right now, would you treat kind of relating to somebody who's dealing with the grief of loneliness different from somebody who's feeling kind of social isolation because they don't have a bunch of friends?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's important that that's where we do the evaluative work ourselves, I think, and that we try to be attentive to those around us who we think might be experiencing loneliness, because everybody's experience of loneliness comes from a different gap. Felicia and Lydia and Laura may have as well all defined loneliness as something that's different from social isolation. Social isolation is a real, that's something that circumstantially happened to a person and really is a different kind of crisis than loneliness itself. But absolutely, when we look at the reason we're feeling lonely, there are going to be certain types of loneliness that are maybe more attainable to, or we can have more hope to have that gap filled in a very specific way than, say, a loss, where you're not able to refill that gap with that same person. And so that grieving process is going to be different. One of the things that's really important, which I hope our listeners will take away listening to this series, is that there is no one experience of loneliness. And that being said, there's also no one way forward from loneliness. A lot of the interviews touched on different ways, so many different ways that we can think about our solitude and our loneliness, and even kind of positive ways of reframing loneliness as something that can be beautiful and can be telling us oh, I'm longing for this one particular thing in my life, or God made me this way. And so that can be a beautiful thing. And at the same time, that's not going to be the case for everybody's loneliness. Some experiences of loneliness just have to be hard because they are just a really hard part of the human experience. And so there is no blanket solution. And I think that was my initial impulse against solution was, well, we're all experiencing this thing, but we are all experiencing it differently. So it's futile to try to say, here's the way out.
Right. You can't do cookie cutter, but you can talk about the ways that careful attention will help in given cases.
Yes.
So have you been paying careful attention to yourself? How has doing this series changed the way that you think about the time you spend alone?
Oh, yes. First of all, my interview with Hedda and with Laura, both really, and with Miroslav, actually, a lot of them, they all encouraged me to be thinking really positively about solitude. Solitude can be such a formative, important thing for ourselves to get to know ourselves as individuals and to kind of find what we want for our place in the world and with God. And not just in the sense of I'm alone and so it's quiet, so I'm talking to God more, but in the sense of as I'm navigating my life alone in these different dimensions, I'm able to listen a little more clearly to what are my intuitions, who is the person God designed me to be? And getting really clear on that outside of voices. And so I've been kind of enjoying thinking about that aspect of things as I engage with aspects of my time alone. But I think one of the things that's been really helpful language to me coming out of this, Miroslav named it first, in our relationships involving risk. When we seek relationship, we invite a certain level of risk because we invite another person closer to our own human limits, and we have to trust that person to not cross our limits. That's where we see situations of harm and hurt in relationships. But thinking on a larger scale of the ways that trying to create room for relationship and opening ourselves to relationship inherently involves risk, I don't know. It's been exciting to me. To me, it's raising this question of like, do we want to live our lives comfortable? I think there's a lot of movement in our culture towards comfort. And that's something that was kind of baked into my conversation with Felicia as well, about the way that tech has kind of infiltrated all of our dynamics. It's made relationships in some ways easier on the surface. And certainly is aimed at making a lot of different aspects of our lived daily lives more comfortable. And so realizing, we have to be willing to embrace some risk in our lives and to take a step towards this might hurt me in any form of relationship. That I think is something that many people in my generation, and I think in our world at large, are maybe inclined against right now. And we're built relationally, and therefore I have to be open to taking these risks in order to flourish. I mean, have to is something that I hold to myself personally. But I think it's asking yourself that question of how much risk am I willing to take to fill that gap that I have between what I want and what I have when we're sitting with these lonely emotions is an important self-evaluatory question. So I'm coming away encouraged by that, thinking about when I step into a relationship, acknowledging that this is a risk. I think I also am able to acknowledge that I'm not entitled to relationship. I'm able to embrace those relationships of any form as a gift in my life. And that's been new language. So I've been really grateful for that in particular.
Yeah, your reflection there reminds me of this realization I had shortly after my daughter was born, my first child, where it suddenly struck me, and I don't know why it hadn't before, but it struck me, I think, in church one afternoon as we were singing a song, that suddenly there was a whole new kind and degree of sadness that was possible in my life. That this new relationship with this little infant meant a whole new array of awful things could come to pass that would crush me in ways that I hadn't been open to before. And that I think is that kind of risk side of attachment. I think it's interesting to hear you talk about solitude as important, but I hear you pushing against the idea that solitude, that it might be worth seeking to be that kind of person who could be kind of content alone indefinitely. Right. That there's a kind of systolic, diastolic rhythm to solitude and relationship. And maybe, if anything, the relational side has the kind of more fundamental place in in that relationship. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that solitude is, because I think I said in my intro narration for the first episode that we hear these headlines all the time about like solitude being like, oh, this incredible athlete did this thing by themselves. And it's like such a feat that they were able to do that by themselves. And there's an element of that's true. And I think we need solitude. Wherever you place yourself on the introvert extrovert scale, we need some solitude in order to know ourselves, in order to know God, and in order to know God in ourselves. And at the same time, we just are relational creatures. And one of the things that I think when you do listen to the interviews, and you'll find interesting in my conversation with Hedda about Julian and the anchorites, was how we have conceptualized them, or maybe this is just me kind of being a fan from the 21st century, having dug into the deepest work on the anchorites, was how we envision them in these little brick cells, totally by themselves, just completely cut off from the world. And that's what the vocation of solitude looked like. And actually, Hedda kind of disrupted that by saying, well, they had this window to the outside. And actually, it was a real problem how much people were talking with them. And even beyond that, how they were completely dependent on their community within the parish, keeping them sustained, keeping them supported so that they could continue to live within that cell. And so even within this sort of extreme of defined vocational solitude, they needed community. And sure, they were made themselves content with not living necessarily with a family as everyone else maybe was, or even partaking in the regular rhythms of the convent life. They still needed to be surrounded by people. And so, yeah, I guess, and that's kind of what comes up for me when I'm saying that, like, loneliness is just baked into our human experience. I experience that both as like a hard thing to kind of embrace, but also as liberating, that when you're feeling lonely, like, this is just part of it. It's not that we're necessarily doing something wrong or that we've gotten ourselves off track in some way.
Yeah, it's not like I'm broken and therefore
Right.
I'm lonely.
Right. And I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about around the language of like the epidemic of loneliness, now that I've had these conversations, is how if we label loneliness as this kind of disease outside of ourselves that's like kind of infiltrated our lives, I think it paints it as something that has happened to us that is bad, that we need to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just not true. I think it's yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, I don't want anyone who's listening to the series to be living with loneliness in heavy ways for too long. And at the same time, it's there to tell us really important things about the way that we were built and about our relationships. And I hope that in listening to this series, folks might come away with this same sense that I have of like, okay, when I feel loneliness, I don't have to be kind of beating up on myself for, well, why I shouldn't be feeling this. I should come up with a solution for it. I have all these ways of being connected to people. That negative self-talk, we can be liberated from that and say, actually, I'm feeling lonely because it's part of the way that God designed me. I want to desire a relationship.
So here's a place I want to push and explore just a little bit more, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me that one possible step from the stance that you just laid out would be something like resentment. Because if I'm chronically lonely and don't infer that this means that there's something wrong with me, that I'm emotionally regulated or malfunctioning or something of that sort, but that it's pointing me to the fact that God made me for a relationship.
Yeah.
But the world seems to be offering me no relationship. There seems like a pretty easy step in towards a sort of resentment or anger or rage.
Yeah.
Towards a world that is maybe like actually thwarting some of the relational needs that God has given me. Or that could go, I mean, nobody's going to see this clearly, right? So it probably quite often goes through, I have certain socially defined understandings of what it is, that what relational needs I have and what the world owes me. And I'm kind of resentful in very malformed ways. You see the sort of the kind of like the emotional constellation that I'm potentially worried about here in thinking like, in trying to thwart the loneliness as just a problem.
Yeah. That is something that I've been thinking about. And I think for me, this is where the role of faith really intercedes, in that I really don't believe that God wants to skimp on relationships for any of us. I really believe that if God created us for a relationship, that if we turn ourselves that way, that God will delight in bringing us those relationships. And at the same time, absolutely, there are people who are just in circumstantially unfair situations and are really struggling to have access to those. And in that case, that's where I grieve along with them, that we live in a world that is imperfect, and that we live in a world where it's possible for some people to be isolated and to have to live with those emotions. That is a reason to grieve, I think. And this is also where I'm thinking about those who are listening, who are not sitting with specific feelings of loneliness. This is the call to the church that, like Felicia was naming, of this is where we need to be more proactive in seeking out those in our communities who might be feeling lonely. And so it has to be a both and. I think if we're sitting with feelings of loneliness, we have to try to take that as a signal to say, okay, where are my neighbors that I can just reach out a little bit, and to try to open ourselves to that risk, even if our neighbors are the outside world, as Laura was talking about. It's such an important aspect of being. Yep.
And is more immediately available more of the time, more people than potentially social relationships.
So
right?
much more. Yes. And I think our cups can also be filled in that sense by smaller interactions. And once we start, I was reflecting on the other day, I was taking a walk in my neighborhood. And when I'm on a walk, I usually get like pretty deep in my imagination, and I'm like kind of zoned out to the world around me. And I was walking for a while, and it took me a number of moments to realize that there was a woman trying to get my attention who had been like yelling at me for a little bit. And when she finally got my attention, she was like, "Hi, I'm so sorry to interrupt your walk. I am hoping that you might come over to my porch and take a picture of me in front of my house, because I just moved here and I don't know anybody, and my family wants a picture of me in front of my porch. But I don't have anybody to do that." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry you had to chase me a whole block. Yes, absolutely. I'll come take a picture of you." And my first instinct when I was having this interaction was like, oh, I feel sad for her that she doesn't have roommates or friends immediately here to take this picture for her. Mm-hmm. But then I took the photo, and she introduced herself, and I introduced myself, and I asked where she was coming from and where her family was. And we had this little interaction. She said, "Thank you so much." And then we went our separate ways. And I'm probably never going to see her again. But I realized, like, actually, I was there. And I was able to share that moment with her. And sure, we're not going to build a deep relationship. She's not going to be one of the people who's digging into my life in the way that we really need. But that was something. And I think that was a really beautiful exchange. And so it's moments like that that I think we are capable of cultivating if we open ourselves to them. And so again, that's not to say like there are absolutely circumstantial situations that are going to place people in unfair situations of loneliness. And that's where I hope that we can, as people of faith, continue to try to seek out those people where they aren't able to seek out others. But at the same time, those of us who are going about our lives with these different varieties of loneliness, that maybe we do have the opportunity to turn outside ourselves. I think we can't underestimate what those small interactions can do for the world and each other.
I was going to ask you, what would you want to leave listeners with? But maybe that's it.
That might be it. Yeah.
Thank you, Macie. This has been a really fun conversation.
Thank you for joining me. Thank you for being on solo, Ryan.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Macie Bridge. Production assistance by Alexa Rollo, Emily Brookfield, and Hope Shun. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu and lifeworthliving.yale.edu, where you can find past episodes, articles, videos, books, and other educational resources that help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to the show, remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And if you've been listening for a while, consider this request. Share one of your favorite episodes, maybe it's this one, in your next conversation, whether it's with family, friends, coworkers, or online. As always, thanks for listening, friends. We'll be back with more soon.